The call center lights never went off. Phones rang through the night while water still covered the streets. People begged for help. Forms moved faster than the flood. Someone learned how easy it was to lie. A claim went through using a house that did not exist. Another used a name pulled from a dead man. Money moved before anyone checked. Speed was the mission. Verification was the cost. Inside the system, a contractor flagged the duplicates. Same numbers, same patterns, different voices. The warning went up the chain and stopped. Leaders said, keep paying. People were cold. Optics mattered. Outside, real survivors waited. Inside, prepaid cards filled with federal cash drained at gas stations and liquor stores miles from the storm. Every approval made the next lie easier. This is not about one thief. It is about what happens when disaster meets urgency and trust becomes a vulnerability. The question is simple. Who noticed first? And why did it take so long to stop? Chapter 1. And stakes. The storm made landfall before dawn. Wind tore roofs apart, water climbed past street signs, power went dark block by block. By 7:42 a.m., emergency declarations were signed, and federal aid systems began to open. The goal was simple: get money and shelter to people fast. Within hours, an emergency housing program went live. Hotels were authorized. Short-term rentals were approved. Cash assistance portals reopened with relaxed rules. Identity checks were reduced. Address verification was deferred. Officials said speed mattered more than perfection. The volume hit immediately. Tens of thousands of applications poured in before noon. Many came from zip codes still underwater. Some came from places untouched by the storm. That did not stop approvals. The system was built to move, not to pause. At 9:18 a.m., the first documented false claim entered the queue. It listed a street that did not exist. The house number skipped from 32 to 36. There was no 34. The claim still cleared the first screen. No human looked at it. The applicant selected hotel assistance. The system generated a payment authorization. A prepaid card number was assigned. The card was loaded that afternoon. The money was spent before nightfall. This was not discovered in real time. It surfaced later through internal audit logs. At the moment, nothing broke. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. Inside the State Emergency Operations Center, officials faced a blunt choice: slow down and risk public outrage, or push money out and fix mistakes later. They chose speed. A senior official addressed staff that morning. The message was brief: people are suffering. Do not create barriers. Get help out the door. Any concerns can be addressed after the immediate crisis. That instruction traveled fast. Verification steps were skipped. Manual reviews were waived. Flags that once triggered holds were temporarily disabled. By early afternoon, contractors monitoring data integrity began to notice something else: duplicate identifiers. The same social security number appearing on multiple claims. Different names, different addresses, same number. One contractor flagged it in a routine report. The wording was cautious: possible duplication due to manual entry errors. Recommend review if volume continues. The report was sent up the chain. It landed in an inbox buried under crisis updates. No response came back. At 3:30 p.m., a second report was sent. This one was clearer. Multiple claims share identical identifiers. Pattern suggests intentional misuse. Recommend temporary pause on affected batches. This message also went unanswered. By evening, call centers were overwhelmed. Real survivors waited on hold for hours. Some slept in cars, others stayed with relatives. Many did not yet know help was available. Meanwhile, approvals continued to accelerate. Automated rules approved claims every few seconds. Each approval triggered a payment. Each payment created a new opportunity for abuse. No single person controlled the system. Responsibility was distributed across agencies. Federal programs relied on state data. State systems relied on contractors. Contractors relied on rules written years earlier for smaller disasters. The storm changed the scale overnight. In one internal briefing, a state analyst raised concerns. The analyst pointed to a cluster of claims filed from outside the disaster zone within the first 6 hours. The analyst asked whether geolocation checks should be enabled. The response was firm. Not now. We cannot risk excluding anyone who evacuated early. That decision was documented. It would matter later. By midnight, the first day totals were staggering. Tens of millions authorized, thousands of hotel nights booked, prepaid cards shipped overnight. At this stage, there were no arrests, no named suspects, no confirmed fraud totals. There were only indicators. The indicators were subtle. Addresses that mapped to empty lots, phone numbers reused across claims, banking details that routed to prepaid accounts rather than traditional banks. These details were visible only to those looking for them, and very few had the bandwidth to look. The emergency environment rewarded silence. Raising alarms slowed things down. Slowing things down invited scrutiny. Scrutiny could be seen as obstruction. Inside government, optics mattered. Officials faced cameras daily. They promised help. They showed charts of approvals climbing. They did not talk about verification. Behind the scenes, the whistleblower contractor tried again. This time, the contractor requested a direct call. The contractor documented concerns in writing and asked for guidance on whether to escalate to inspectors. The reply came back late that night. Continue monitoring. Do not disrupt payments. That response would later be reviewed. At the time, it closed the door. The system stayed open through the night. Claims filed at 2 a.m. were approved before sunrise. Some came from the same devices. Some used variations of the same address. None were stopped. This chapter of the story is not about villains yet. It is about conditions. A natural disaster collided with an administrative machine optimized for speed. Controls were intentionally loosened. Warnings were logged but deprioritized. The first false claim was not unique. It was simply the first one, later proven to be false. Many more followed, but at this point, no one knew how many. What was clear, even on day one, was that the door was wide open. And once money began moving, closing that door would be politically and operationally painful. By the end of the first 24 hours, the question was no longer whether fraud existed. The question was how much risk leaders were willing to tolerate in the name of urgency. That question would not be answered yet. Chapter 2, Escalation and Reversal. By the third day, the data no longer looked random. Analysts working 12-hour shifts began to see shape in the noise. Claims were not just high, they were clustered. Entire blocks of applications shared the same timing, filed minutes apart, approved in sequence, paid within hours. Many came from regions untouched by wind or flood. Some listed evacuation addresses hundreds of miles away with no supporting records. At first, managers explained it away. Families evacuate together, shelters share computers, volunteers help people apply in batches. These explanations bought time. But the patterns kept tightening. One analyst ran a heat map of claims by location. The storm zone glowed red as expected, but there were bright islands far outside it, suburban neighborhoods, rural towns, places that never lost power. Another analyst focused on payment methods. A large percentage of claims routed to prepaid cards instead of bank accounts. That alone was not suspicious. Many disaster survivors are unbanked. But the same prepaid card issuers kept appearing. So did the same card reload locations, gas stations, convenience stores, liquor stores, all far from the disaster. The analysts escalated internally. This time the language was sharper. Not possible error, not anomaly, pattern consistent with organized misuse. An internal meeting was called. State officials, federal liaisons, contractors, legal counsel. The call lasted 27 minutes. One slide summarized the concern. Claims filed from outside the impact zone are draining funds at scale. Identity reuse detected. Recommend targeted pause. The response came quickly. A pause would trigger backlash. Media coverage would turn. Survivors would accuse the government of abandoning them. The decision was not framed as denial. It was framed as balance. Keep aid flowing while quietly investigating. That balance shifted the burden to investigators. Find the fraud without slowing the system. Task forces were assembled quietly. No press releases, no announcements. Analysts were told to work around the flow, not through it. They began tracing money. Funds moved from federal accounts to state systems, from state systems to prepaid cards, from cards to cash withdrawals and purchases. The speed was striking. Cards were often emptied within hours of being loaded. One investigator mapped card usage. Several cards were used at the same terminal minutes apart, same store, same register, different names on file. That was the first clear sign of coordination. Next came the identity data. Investigators cross-checked social security numbers. Many belonged to real people. Some were deceased. Others were alive and had not applied for aid. These were not random guesses. The data had been harvested. Investigators briefed leadership again. The tone shifted. This was no longer opportunistic fraud by individuals. This looked like organized rings exploiting a known vulnerability. Still, payments continued. Internal emails from that period would later become central. In them, mid-level managers warned of cascading losses. Senior officials replied with instructions to stay the course. One email stood out: "We cannot shut this down mid-disaster. The political cost is too high." That line did not order fraud, but it set the priority. As days passed, investigators began linking claims together. Phone numbers reused across applications, IP addresses clustered, slight spelling variations in names, identical formatting errors. These details pointed to scripts, automated filing tools, human operators feeding stolen identity data into portals designed for trust. The fraud rings adapted quickly. When one prepaid issuer was flagged, they switched to another. When one address pattern was blocked, they adjusted the syntax. Every control added was met with a workaround. Inside the task force, frustration grew. Analysts wanted authority to freeze suspect batches. Lawyers warned that freezing the wrong claims could delay aid to real victims and invite lawsuits. Leadership hesitated. Then came the reversal. A senior federal partner reviewed the data independently. The partner focused on timing. Claims filed before certain public announcements showed higher fraud indicators. The partner concluded the rings had pre-positioned identity data and were waiting for the disaster. This was not reactive crime, it was anticipatory. That finding changed the stakes. If organized groups could anticipate disasters, then emergency systems themselves had become predictable targets. The partner briefed state leadership. The briefing was blunt. Continuing payments without controls would multiply losses and undermine public trust. The room went quiet. A compromise emerged. Payments would continue, but targeted interventions would begin. Certain card issuers would be monitored. Certain address patterns would trigger holds. Law enforcement would prepare but not yet act. This was not a shutdown. It was a quiet pivot. Investigators were given limited authority to flag accounts for review after payment. That meant money could still leave, but trails would be preserved. For some, this felt like progress. For others, it felt too late. Outside government, survivors were growing angry. Hotels were full. Vouchers were delayed. Call centers blamed volume. No one mentioned fraud. Inside the fraud rings, activity surged. Whether by luck or insight, they sensed the window narrowing. Claim volume spiked again. Cards drained faster. Investigators watched in real time as millions moved through the system. They documented everything: timestamps, locations, card numbers, merchant IDs. The work was meticulous and exhausting. At the end of the second week, leadership faced a new reality. The problem could no longer be handled quietly. Losses were mounting. Media inquiries were starting. Inspectors were asking questions. The timer had started. The system that prized speed above all else had created a second disaster, one measured in dollars and trust. Stopping it now would require visible action, and visible action would mean admitting what had already happened. That admission had not yet come. Chapter 3. Resolution and Aftermath. The first freezes happened just before dawn. No announcement, no warning. Accounts flagged overnight were locked quietly. Prepaid cards stopped working mid-swipe. Transactions failed at registers in half-lit stores. By noon, investigators had enough to move. Federal agents coordinated with state authorities and card issuers. Lists were finalized. Merchant IDs tied to concentrated withdrawals were flagged. Shell accounts linked to bulk claims were isolated. Warrants were prepared. The raids came in waves. In several states, agents knocked on doors tied to high-volume claim clusters. Some locations were empty. Others held laptops, phones, printed identity lists. In a few cases, operators were caught mid-filing, screens still open to aid portals. Prosecutors announced the confirmed fraud totals 2 days later. The number was lower than internal estimates, but still staggering. Hundreds of millions in verified losses, thousands of false claims, dozens of active cases. Officials emphasized restraint. The figure reflected proven fraud only. Investigations were ongoing. More cases were expected. Survivors watched the press conference with mixed reactions: relief that action was taken, anger that it took so long. In shelters and temporary housing, people told the same story. They applied early and waited. Others got cards fast and disappeared. Some hotel vouchers were canceled because funds ran short. Families slept in cars while money drained elsewhere. Those delays were documented. Inspectors later confirmed that fraud had slowed legitimate aid in multiple regions, not because money was gone entirely, but because systems were overwhelmed cleaning up abuse. Oversight bodies moved quickly. Inspectors general launched parallel reviews. Congressional committees requested documents. Internal emails were preserved. Decision timelines were reconstructed. One question dominated every review: why were early warnings not acted on? Officials testified that the environment demanded speed, that no system was designed for that scale, that pausing aid would have caused harm. Those statements were factually accurate. They were also incomplete. Documents showed that leaders understood the risk early. They chose to accept it, not because they ignored fraud, but because they feared the consequences of slowing help more. That distinction mattered legally. It did not matter politically. Several officials resigned quietly months later. Others were reassigned. No criminal charges were filed against decision-makers. Investigators found no evidence of personal gain. The cost was institutional. Reforms followed. Identity checks were rebuilt, address verification tools were integrated, prepaid card controls were tightened, data sharing between agencies improved. Emergency systems were redesigned to scale with fewer blind spots. Not perfect, better. Clawback efforts recovered some funds, card issuers returned unused balances, merchants cooperated. A fraction of the money came back. Most did not. Prosecutors continued to announce cases over the next year. Organized rings, individual opportunists. Some sentences were long, others were short. All came after the damage. In interviews, investigators reflected on the dilemma. Disaster response demands trust. Fraud exploits trust. Controls slow help. Speed invites abuse. There was no clean solution. Only trade-offs. The final Inspector General report was blunt. Emergency systems must assume they are targets. Speed cannot replace safeguards. Early warnings must trigger action, not documentation. That report closed the official chapter. The public moved on, but the cost remained. For survivors, the disaster did not end when the water receded. It lingered in delays, denials, and disbelief. For agencies, it lingered in audits and reforms. For the system, it lingered as a scar. The story is not about thieves alone. It is about pressure, about decisions made in crisis, about how good intentions can widen doors that should never fully open. When the next storm comes, the systems will move fast again. They will have to. The question is whether they will move smarter, because disaster always brings urgency, and urgency always tests trust.